Maddox Thompson had $21 left to his name. He gave every single bill to a crying stranger at a bus stop. He thought it was the stupidest decision of his life. But the next morning, before his 7-year-old son could even eat breakfast, 6 black SUVs pulled up outside their apartment. Men in dark suits stepped out, hands reaching for earpieces. Neighbors gathered on balconies, phones recording. His son screamed in terror. Maddox stood frozen in his doorway, heart pounding. Were they here to arrest him or to repay him? The day Maddox Thompson lost his job, he didn't tell his son. He walked through the door of their small apartment in East Baltimore, hung his jacket on the same hook he'd used for 7 years, and smiled like nothing had happened. Isaiah was sitting at the kitchen table, crayons scattered around a half-finished drawing. "Hey, little man, what are you making?" Isaiah held up the paper. It showed 2 stick figures standing in front of a yellow house with a big sun overhead. One figure was tall and dark, the other small. Both were smiling. "It's us," Isaiah said. "When we get our own house." Maddox felt something crack in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "That's beautiful, son. Real beautiful." He moved to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Half a carton of milk, 3 eggs, a pack of bologna with 2 slices left. He counted the bills in his wallet for the 3rd time that day. $21, that was everything. The last paycheck had gone to rent and the electric bill. He'd planned to buy groceries tomorrow, but tomorrow there would be no more paychecks. His supervisor had called him into the office that morning with a tight smile. "Budget cuts, Maddox. Nothing personal." But Maddox had seen the way Mr. Henderson avoided his eyes. He knew the real reason. Last week, he'd refused to work an unpaid overtime shift because Isaiah had a fever. The other workers, most of them white, had declined plenty of times without consequence. But Maddox understood how things worked. He'd learned that lesson long before he ever set foot in that warehouse. He remembered being 17, walking home from his aunt's house. 2 police officers had stopped him, pushed him against a wall, and searched his pockets. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. They let him go without an apology. It happened again when he was 22. Same story, different officers. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong skin. No charges either time, but the feeling never left him, that sense of being guilty until proven innocent, and sometimes not even then. "Daddy, are you okay?" Maddox turned to find Isaiah watching him with those big, serious eyes. The boy was only 7, but he carried himself like someone who had already seen too much. Losing his mother at 3 years old had done that to him. Cancer had taken her quickly, and Maddox often wondered how much Isaiah actually remembered versus how much he'd constructed from photographs and stories. "I'm fine, buddy. Just thinking about dinner." "Are we having pancakes?" Isaiah's face lit up. Maddox made pancakes whenever money was tight. The boy didn't know that yet. Didn't know that pancakes meant they couldn't afford anything else. "Maybe tomorrow morning. Special breakfast." That night, Maddox couldn't sleep. He lay on the worn couch, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, calculating how long $21 could last. 3 days if he was careful. Maybe 4 if he skipped meals himself. He had a job interview tomorrow at a restaurant downtown. Dishwasher position. It wasn't much, but it was something. The interview lasted exactly 4 minutes. The manager, a heavy man with a mustache and impatient eyes, looked at Maddox's application and shook his head. "We need someone with restaurant experience." "I learn fast. I've worked in warehouses for 7 years. I'm reliable." "I'm sure you are." The manager was already looking past him toward the door. "We'll keep your application on file." Maddox knew what that meant. He'd heard it before. He walked out into the cold night air, his breath forming small clouds in front of him. The bus wouldn't come for another 40 minutes, so he sat down on the bench at the stop and buried his face in his hands. That's when he heard the crying. A woman sat at the other end of the bench, her shoulders shaking. She looked to be in her mid-40s, with short dark hair and clothes that seemed expensive, a blazer tailored pants, but everything was disheveled. One of her high heels was broken, hanging at an awkward angle. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. Maddox hesitated. In his experience, getting involved in other people's problems usually made his own worse, but she was sobbing so hard that something in him couldn't look away. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't realized anyone else was there. Her eyes were red and swollen, but behind the tears there was something sharp. Alert. It disappeared so quickly that Maddox thought he might have imagined it. "I was robbed," she said, her voice trembling. "They took my purse, my phone, everything. I don't have any way to get home." Maddox looked at her more closely. Her watch was still on her wrist, a slim gold thing that looked expensive. If someone had robbed her, why leave that behind? And her clothes, despite being rumpled, showed no signs of a struggle. But then she started crying harder, and his doubts melted away. Maybe the robber had been in a hurry. Maybe she'd hidden the watch. It wasn't his place to interrogate a woman in distress. "Where do you live?" "North suburbs. I just need about $20 for a cab. I'll pay you back, I swear. I just need to get home to my daughter." $20. Maddox thought about Isaiah sleeping in their apartment, about the empty refrigerator, about the pancake mix that was almost gone. $21 was all he had in the world. But he also thought about all the times he'd needed help and no one had offered. All the times he'd stood alone wondering if anyone saw him as human. He reached into his wallet and pulled out every bill, 2 tens and a 1. "Here." He handed her all $21. "Take it. Get home safe." She took the money with both hands, her fingers cold against his. For a moment, she just stared at him, and that sharpness returned to her eyes, a look of calculation that seemed out of place on a robbery victim's face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I won't forget this." She stood up and walked away quickly, not toward the main road where cabs might pass, but toward the shadows at the end of the block. Maddox watched her disappear into the darkness, a strange unease settling in his stomach. He rode the bus home with nothing in his pocket and a growing certainty that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Isaiah was still asleep when Maddox got back. He stood in the doorway of the boy's tiny room watching his son's chest rise and fall. On the nightstand was a crumpled $1 bill that Isaiah kept everywhere he went. His mother had given it to him the week before she died. Emergency money, she'd called it. Isaiah had never spent it. Maddox whispered into the darkness, "I'm sorry, baby. Daddy messed up." The next morning, he woke to the sound of engines. At first, he thought it was a garbage truck, but the rumbling didn't pass. It grew louder, then stopped altogether, replaced by the sound of car doors opening and closing in rapid succession. Maddox moved to the window and felt his blood turn to ice. 6 black SUVs were parked in front of their building. Men in dark suits stood beside them, some speaking into earpieces, others scanning the area with trained eyes. Neighbors were already gathering on the balconies, phones raised. "Daddy!" Isaiah appeared behind him, rubbing his eyes. "What's happening?" Before Maddox could answer, Mrs. Johnson from next door shouted from her balcony, "Maddox, what did you get yourself into?" Isaiah looked out the window and saw the men, the cars, the phones recording, his face crumpled. "Daddy, are they going to take you away like the police?" The fear in his son's voice cut deeper than anything else could. Maddox knelt down and gripped Isaiah's shoulders. "Listen to me. No matter what happens, I need you to stay inside. Can you do that for me?" Isaiah nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks. Maddox took a breath and opened the door. The woman from last night stepped out of the middle SUV, but she looked nothing like the crying victim he'd helped. Her hair was perfectly styled. Her clothes were immaculate. She walked toward him with the confidence of someone who owned everything she surveyed, and she was staring directly at him. The woman stopped a few feet from Maddox, her security team flanking her like shadows. Up close, she looked even more different from the night before. The tearful, desperate victim had vanished completely, replaced by someone who radiated power and control. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "we need to talk." Maddox didn't move from his doorway. Behind him, he could hear Isaiah's quick, frightened breathing. "I don't know who you are, but you need to leave. Now." "My name is Victoria Reynolds. I'm the CEO of Meridian Holdings." She spoke the words like they should mean something to him. When his expression didn't change, she added, "It's an investment firm, $2.3 billion in assets." Maddox stared at her. A billion-dollar CEO had been crying at a bus stop in East Baltimore, claiming to be robbed. Nothing about this made sense. "I wasn't robbed last night," Victoria continued as if reading his thoughts. "I was running." Running from what? Victoria glanced at the neighbors, still watching from their balconies, phones recording everything. "Can we discuss this inside? What I'm about to tell you could put both of us in danger." Every instinct Maddox had developed over 38 years of being a black man in America screamed at him to refuse. Rich white woman shows up with armed security, wants to come inside his apartment, claims there's danger. This was exactly the kind of situation that ended with him in handcuffs. But Isaiah was still standing behind him, and those SUVs weren't going anywhere. "5 minutes," Maddox said. "Then you leave." He led her into the small living room, painfully aware of how shabby everything must look to someone like her. The worn couch, the crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator. Victoria's security team stayed outside, but Maddox noticed one of them, a tall man with cold eyes, position himself where he could see through the window. Isaiah had retreated to his bedroom doorway, watching the stranger with fear and curiosity. Victoria noticed him immediately. Her expression softened for just a moment before hardening again. 3 weeks ago," she began, "I discovered that my CFO, Robert Hale, has been laundering money through our company, millions of dollars funneled to a criminal organization I'm still trying to identify. When I started gathering evidence, he found out." Maddox crossed his arms. "What does any of this have to do with me?" "Last night I was being followed, Robert's people. I knew they were tracking my phone, my car, everything. So I slipped out during a fundraiser, broke the heel off my shoe to look disheveled, and ran to a part of the city where no one would expect to find me." "The bus stop," Victoria nodded. "I pretended to be a robbery victim because I needed to disappear. If I looked like a wealthy executive, they would have found me within minutes. But if I looked like just another desperate person on the street, they might pass me by." Maddox thought about the gold watch on her wrist, the way she'd cried so convincingly, the sharpness in her eyes that had seemed out of place. It had all been an act. "Your $21 saved my life," Victoria said quietly. "The man following me saw the whole thing. He watched you give me money, and he concluded I was just a homeless woman who happened to look like Victoria Reynolds. He left." The words hung in the air between them. Maddox didn't know whether to believe her or not. He'd been lied to so many times by people who claimed to have his best interests at heart, employers who promised job security, landlords who promised repairs officers who promised to let him go if he just cooperated. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "I gave you money. You got away. We're done." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Because Robert's people took photographs that night. They have your face. Right now, they're trying to figure out who you are, and when they do, they'll assume you know something about me. That makes you a threat." Maddox felt the floor shift beneath his feet. "I don't know anything about you." "They don't know that." Isaiah appeared at Maddox's side, tugging at his sleeve. "Daddy, who is she? Why is she here?" Victoria looked at the boy, and something flickered across her face, guilt maybe, or regret. Maddox stepped in front of his son, blocking her view. "Don't look at my son," he said, his voice low and hard. "Say whatever you need to say and get out of my home." Victoria reached into her jacket and produced a photograph. She held it up for Maddox to see. It showed him sitting at the bus stop, his face clearly visible under the streetlight. The timestamp in the corner read 11:47 p.m. "Robert has this picture," she said. "His people are running facial recognition as we speak. They'll find you, Mr. Thompson. And when they do, they'll assume you're connected to me. They'll come for you." Maddox's hands trembled as he stared at his own image. He thought about Isaiah, about the men in suits outside, about every time the system had crushed him without mercy. "What do you want from me?" "I need someone outside the system. Someone Robert can't trace through my company or my personal connections. I need you to help me deliver evidence to the FBI. And in exchange, $50,000, cash, enough to start over somewhere safe." For a moment, Maddox allowed himself to imagine it. $50,000 would mean a new apartment in a better neighborhood, a real school for Isaiah groceries without counting every penny. It would mean freedom. But he knew better than to trust easy money. "No," he said. "I don't want your money. I just want to be left alone." Victoria's expression didn't change, but her voice dropped. "You think you have that choice? Robert knows your face. He'll find your address, your son's school, everything. The only way you stay safe is if you help me take him down first." Maddox wanted to argue, but the photograph in her hand made it impossible. He was already trapped. Over the next 3 days, Maddox tried to pretend everything was normal. He took Isaiah to school, applied for jobs online, cooked meals from the dwindling supplies in their kitchen. But the world had already begun to close in. On the second day, he noticed a gray sedan parked across the street. It stayed there for 6 hours before driving away. The next morning, a different car took its place. On the third day, Isaiah came home from school with a strange story. "A man talked to me at the gate." The boy said, his voice small and scared. "He asked if you were my daddy. He asked where we lived." Maddox felt his blood run cold. He pulled Isaiah into his arms and held him tight, his mind racing through terrible possibilities. That night, Mrs. Johnson knocked on his door. "Maddox," she said, her eyes full of suspicion. "People are talking. They're saying you got mixed up with drug dealers or the mob. I've known you for years, and I never thought you were that kind of man, but those cars outside, those men in suits—" "I'm not involved in anything," Maddox said, but even to his own ears the denial sounded weak. Mrs. Johnson shook her head and walked away without another word. The neighborhood that had once felt like home now felt like a cage. People who used to wave at Maddox now crossed the street to avoid him. Parents pulled their children away when Isaiah approached, and Isaiah himself was changing. The boy who used to chatter endlessly about school and dinosaurs and superheroes had grown quiet. He spent hours in his room drawing pictures that Maddox was afraid to look at. One evening, Maddox finally looked. The drawing showed a man standing inside a cage made of black bars. Dark shapes surrounded the cage, faceless figures with reaching hands. At the top of the page, Isaiah had written a single word, "Daddy." Maddox stared at the picture until his vision blurred. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and made a decision. The next morning, he called the number Victoria had left him. "I'll do it," he said, "but only if you get my son somewhere safe first." Victoria arranged for them to stay in what she called a safe house, a quiet townhouse in the suburbs with security cameras on every corner and guards posted at the doors. For the first time in days, Maddox felt like he could breathe. Isaiah had his own room with a real bed, and the kitchen was stocked with more food than Maddox had seen in months. But on the third night, everything fell apart. Maddox woke to the sound of breaking glass. He grabbed Isaiah from the bed and ran into the hallway just as the front door exploded inward. But instead of Robert's thugs, he saw police uniforms. "Maddox Thompson," an officer shouted. "Get on the ground now!" "What's happening? I didn't do anything." They slammed him face first into the floor. Isaiah screamed, his small hands reaching for his father as another officer held him back. "You're under arrest for extortion, stalking, and criminal threatening." Maddox's mind went blank. "What are you talking about? I don't even know." The lead officer shoved a folder in front of his face. Inside were printouts of emails, text messages, photographs. The emails showed conversations between someone using his name and Victoria dating back 3 months. The texts demanded $500,000 in exchange for silence. The photographs showed Maddox standing outside a building he'd never seen before, watching Victoria's car. "This isn't real," Maddox gasped. "I never sent any of this. Someone faked it." But the officers weren't listening. They dragged him to his feet and marched him toward the door. And that's when he saw Derek. The tall man with the cold eyes, the one who had watched through the window on the first day, stood in the corner of the room. His arms crossed, his expression calm. He was Victoria's head of security. He was supposed to be on their side. But the way he looked at Maddox told a different story. Their eyes met for just a moment. Derek smiled, a small, satisfied curve of his lips, and Maddox understood. The photographs, the fake emails, the anonymous tip to the police. It had all come from inside Victoria's own team. "Daddy!" Isaiah broke free from the officer holding him and threw himself at Maddox's legs. "Daddy, you promised you didn't do anything wrong. You promised." Maddox couldn't kneel down with his hands cuffed behind his back, but he bent as close to his son as he could. "Listen to me, Isaiah. I need you to be brave. Keep your mama's $1 bill safe, you hear me? I'm going to come back, I promise." Isaiah clutched the crumpled bill from his pocket, the one his mother had given him, and sobbed as they pulled Maddox away. The last thing Maddox saw before they put him in the police car was Derek speaking into his phone, calm and unhurried, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. In the back of the cruiser, Maddox closed his eyes and tried to think. He had no money for a lawyer, no friends in positions of power, no one who would believe a poor black man from East Baltimore over $1 billion company's worth of manufactured evidence. He thought about Isaiah being taken by social services placed with strangers told that his father was a criminal. He thought about the drawing of the cage and how it had become a prophecy. And he thought about Victoria, who was probably just as trapped as he was now, that Derek had revealed himself. Her own security team had turned against her. Robert controlled the media, the evidence, the narrative. For the first time in his life, Maddox understood what it truly meant to lose everything. Not the job, not the money, not even his freedom. It was the moment he saw his son's face disappear through the car window and realized he might never see it again. The holding cell smelled like sweat and disinfectant. Maddox sat on the metal bench, his back against the cold wall, counting the cracks in the ceiling. 3 days had passed since his arrest. 3 days since he'd seen Isaiah's face disappearing through the car window. His public defender, a tired young woman named Sarah, had visited him twice. She did her best, but Maddox could see the truth in her eyes. She had too many cases and too few resources. Against the mountain of evidence stacked against him, she didn't stand a chance. "The prosecution is offering a deal," Sarah told him on the 3rd day. "Plead guilty to a lesser charge. You'd serve 18 months instead of 10 years. 10 years. The number echoed in Maddox's head like a death sentence. Isaiah would be 17 by the time he got out. A stranger. A young man who had grown up without his father believing his daddy was a criminal. "If I take the deal," Maddox asked, "what happens to my son?" Sarah looked down at her notes. "Foster care, unless you have family who can take him." Maddox had no family. His parents were gone. His sister had died young. Isaiah had no one except him. "I'll think about it," he said. That night, Maddox lay on the thin mattress and stared at the darkness. Maybe it was better this way. 18 months was survivable. Isaiah would be placed with a family, maybe a good one. He would go to school, make friends, forget about the father who had let him down. Maybe pleading guilty was the kindest thing Maddox could do. The next morning, a guard appeared at his cell. "Thompson, you have a visitor." Maddox expected Sarah again, but when he walked into the visiting room, he saw Mrs. Johnson sitting behind the glass. Her face was drawn, her eyes red from crying. "Maddox," her voice crackled through the phone. "I came to apologize." He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. "I believed the rumors," she continued. "I thought you'd gotten mixed up in something bad." "But that boy of yours," her voice broke. "He keeps telling everyone you didn't do it. He sits at the window every day waiting for you to come home." Maddox gripped the phone so hard his knuckles ached. Mrs. Johnson reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She pressed it against the glass so he could see. It was a drawing. 2 stick figures stood in front of a yellow house with a big sun overhead. One tall and dark, one small, both smiling. At the top of the page, Isaiah had written, "Daddy comes home." "He drew this for you," Mrs. Johnson said. "He told me to tell you he still believes." Maddox stared at the drawing until his vision blurred. This was the opposite of the cage picture. This was hope. "Mrs. Johnson," he said slowly, "I need your help." That night, Maddox couldn't sleep, but for a different reason. His mind raced through every detail of the fake evidence, searching for cracks. The emails. The prosecution claimed he'd been emailing Victoria for 3 months, plotting extortion. But Maddox had never used Gmail in his life. When his wife was alive, she'd set up a Yahoo account for him. He still used it rarely to check job listings. He didn't even know how to create a new email address. The photographs. They showed him standing outside a building watching Victoria's car. But the timestamp on those photos was the same day as his restaurant interview. He'd spent that entire afternoon preparing, then riding buses across town. He'd never been anywhere near that building. The text messages. They came from a smartphone demanding $500,000. But Maddox had never owned a smartphone. He still carried the same flip phone he'd bought 5 years ago because it was the cheapest option. The evidence was fake, and whoever had faked it didn't know him at all. But Derek did. Derek had watched him through the window that first day. Derek had access to all of Victoria's security resources. Derek knew enough to frame him, but not enough to know the small details of his life. The next morning, Maddox called Sarah. "I need you to get camera footage from a restaurant downtown," he said. "The manager's name was something with a mustache. I was there for a job interview on the day those photos were supposedly taken." Sarah sounded skeptical. "Maddox, that's a long shot." "It's all I have, and I need you to call Mrs. Johnson. She can testify that I've only ever had a flip phone. She's seen it 100 times. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Sarah sighed. "I'll see what I can do." The courtroom was smaller than Maddox had imagined. The judge, an older white man with glasses, sat behind a high desk. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman in a gray suit, arranged her papers with practiced efficiency. Sarah sat beside Maddox, looking nervous but determined. The gallery was mostly empty, except for a few reporters, and in the back row, Mrs. Johnson. She had Isaiah beside her. The boy's eyes locked onto Maddox the moment he entered, and something in Maddox's chest cracked open. The prosecutor presented her evidence with confidence. Emails, photographs, text messages, a clear pattern of stalking and extortion. She painted Maddox as a calculating predator who had targeted a vulnerable woman. Then it was Sarah's turn. She called the restaurant manager to the stand. He confirmed reluctantly that Maddox had been at his establishment for a job interview on the day in question. He even produced security footage showing Maddox sitting in the waiting area at the exact time the prosecution claimed he was across town stalking Victoria. Next, Sarah called Mrs. Johnson. The old woman testified that she'd known Maddox for years, that he'd always carried a simple flip phone, that she'd never seen him with anything more advanced. Finally, Sarah addressed the court directly. "Your Honor, the emails were sent from a Gmail account. My client has only ever used Yahoo. The texts came from a smartphone he's never owned. The photographs place him somewhere he couldn't have been. This evidence wasn't just flawed, it was manufactured by someone with access to the victim's security team." The prosecutor objected, but the judge's expression had shifted. Doubt crept into his eyes. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Victoria Reynolds walked in, flanked by 2 FBI agents. Her face was pale but resolute. Behind her in handcuffs walked Robert Hale. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel demanding order, but no one was listening. Victoria approached the bench and handed over a folder. "These are internal communications between Derek Walsh and Robert Hale," she said, her voice steady. "They detail the plan to frame Maddox Thompson. Derek was Robert's inside man from the beginning." She turned to the judge and explained how she had escaped. After Maddox's arrest, Derek had assumed Victoria was neutralized, isolated from her resources. But Victoria had anticipated betrayal. She'd hidden a backup phone in a safety deposit box months earlier, before any of this began. While Derek watched her publicly, she slipped away during a staged medical appointment and contacted the FBI directly. It had taken 3 days to gather enough evidence to move against Robert, but she had done it. Derek, who had been sitting in the gallery as a witness for the prosecution, rose to his feet. His cold eyes darted toward the exit. But before anyone could react, a small voice cut through the chaos. "You're a liar!" Isaiah had broken free from Mrs. Johnson's grip. He stood in the aisle, pointing directly at Derek, his whole body trembling with fury. "You were there when they took my daddy. You smiled. You're the bad guy." Derek froze. For just a moment, his mask slipped. His eyes flickered with something that looked like guilt before hardening again. "The boy doesn't know what he's talking about." But the damage was done. The FBI agents moved toward Derek. He tried to run, but they caught him before he reached the door. An hour later, Maddox Thompson walked out of the courthouse a free man. Isaiah slammed into him at full speed, wrapping his arms around his father's waist and refusing to let go. Maddox knelt down and held his son so tight that neither of them could breathe. "I told you," Isaiah whispered. "I told everyone you didn't do it." "You did, baby. You did." Victoria approached them slowly, keeping a respectful distance. Her security team was gone. Robert was in FBI custody. Derek would soon join him. "I'm sorry," she said, "for all of it. You got pulled into something that was never your fight." Maddox stood, his hand still resting on Isaiah's shoulder. "What happens now?" "Robert will face federal charges. So will Derek. The company will survive eventually." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I owe you more than I can ever repay." Maddox shook his head. "I don't want your money." Victoria nodded as if she'd expected that answer. "Then let me offer you something else. There's a warehouse manager position at one of our partner companies. Steady hours, good benefits, health insurance. It's yours if you want it." Maddox thought about the 7 years he'd given to his last job and the 4 minutes it had taken to lose everything. He thought about Isaiah's drawings, about the cage and the sun. "I'll take it," he said. "But not because I owe you anything. Because my son deserves a father who can take care of him." 3 months later, Maddox and Isaiah sat on a bench at a bus stop. The same bus stop where everything had begun. Isaiah was drawing in a notebook. He held up the page for Maddox to see. 2 stick figures in front of a small house, a sun overhead, trees on either side. Both figures were smiling. "That's our new apartment," Isaiah said proudly. Maddox smiled. "It's perfect." A man approached the bench, shabby clothes hanging loose on his thin frame. He looked at Maddox with tired eyes. "Excuse me, sir. Do you have any change? I just need enough to make a phone call." Maddox looked at Isaiah. The boy met his father's gaze and nodded slowly. Maddox reached into his pocket and pulled out a few dollars. He handed them to the stranger. "Here. I hope things get better for you." The man's face softened with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you. God bless you." As the stranger walked away, Isaiah leaned against his father's arm. "Daddy, how do you know he won't waste it?" Maddox watched the man disappear around the corner, the same corner where Victoria Reynolds had vanished into the shadows all those months ago. "I don't know what will happen," he said, "but sometimes you just have to believe." Isaiah nodded and went back to his drawing. In his pocket, the crumpled $1 bill from his mother rested safely. It wasn't emergency money anymore. It was lucky money. And for the first time in a very long time, Maddox Thompson believed that luck might actually be real.